All right, we're going to talk about derivatives of trig functions today. So we're going to kind of look at the sine one, and then we're going to kind of just explain the others. So the derivative of sine. So if f of x equals sine of x, and I want to know the derivative of that, so that becomes f prime equals the limit as h goes to 0 of sine of x plus h minus sine of x over h. Okay, pretty straightforward. You're going to have to use the sum angle addition here on the sine. So that gives me limit as h goes to 0 of sine x cosine h plus cosine x sine h minus sine x all over h. Okay, so I notice that I have a sine x here and a sine x here, so I'm going to kind of combine those, right? So I'm going to pull out a sine x here, so that gives me cosine h minus 1. So that's where this came from, okay? So limit is h goes to 0 of sine x times cosine h minus 1 over h plus, and then I have this piece here. The limit is h goes to 0 of cosine x sine h over h. Well, sine x and cosine x don't have an h in it, so we're going to pull those out front, okay? So that's where I get sine x equals limit of cosine h minus 1 over h plus cosine x limit as h goes to 0 of sine h over h. Well, this whole piece right here is 0, okay, from the previous piece, and this from the previous chapter, and this equals 1. So I end up with sine x times 0 plus cosine x times 1. So the derivative of sine x is cosine. So this is something that you need to remember. So the derivative of sine x is going to be cosine x, and then you're going to need to know the derivative of cosine x. Those two are the most important. Everything else is based off of those, okay? So the other four can be based off of what sine and cosine is. So our example 1, we're going to find the derivative here. So y prime equals, well, the derivative of x squared, if you remember power rules, that gives me 2x. Minus, well, the derivative of sine is cosine, so minus cosine x. Here I have e the x times sine x, so now we're going to have to use the product rule. So the first times the derivative of the second, cosine x, plus the second, sine x times the derivative of the first, e to the x. There's my derivative. I usually won't write it like this. I'll usually write it like this. Just because I like to have stuff in front, okay? So now we have a quotient rule, right? So I now have x times the derivative of the first, so low d high minus high d low over low low. So the derivative of the top is going to give me cosine x minus sine x times the derivative of the bottom. Well, the derivative of x is just x. All over the bottom squared, which is just x squared, okay? The derivative of cosine. We could go through this whole process again for cosine. Just understand that the derivative of cosine is going to give me negative sine, okay? So that's important to understand. Derivative of sine is positive cosine. Derivative of cosine is negative sine. So here's my first one. I'm going to take the derivative here. That gives me 5 e to the x minus sine x. Now I have a product rule, so I have y prime equals the first, sine x times the derivative of the second, which is negative sine x, plus the second times the derivative of the first. So I end up with negative sine squared x plus cosine squared x. All right? Now, the last thing is we're just going to talk about the other four trig functions. The derivative of tangent is going to give me secant squared. If you can't remember the derivative of tangent, this is actually just the quotient rule of sine and cosine. Okay, so you could find that out. The derivative of secant is secant tangent. The derivative of cotangent is negative cosecant squared. And the derivative of cosecant is negative cosecant x cotangent x. Now, that being said, if you look at in your book, in the back pages, they have all these rules on derivatives. Okay, so the back cover has some antiderivatives, And then there's a whole bunch of rules on those kind of back covers there. So if you tend to forget these, they are there in your book. They're easy access. You can go to the back of the book. They're right there. These ones you really should memorize, okay? Derivative of sine is cosine, and derivative of cosine is negative sine. Memorize those.